Does who we marry really matter? It actually does, and today we're going to see that in a big way as Abraham finds a wife for his son Isaac. It's really, really important, and along with that, we're going to learn how to trust God, and we're going to talk about camels. Join us today. Good morning, welcome to our Genesis series. Glad you're joining us today. Today we are going to talk about the longest chapter in Genesis. And what's interesting about this chapter is it's actually a love story with kind of an arranged marriage twist to it. Now, here's something interesting. When you open the books of Genesis, you're going to see that 25 verses in Genesis are given in regards to just creation alone. 6 verses are given to the creation of man alone. But today we're going to see that 67 verses are given to how one man, Isaac, Abraham's son, gets a bride. Her name will be Rebecca. I thought this was kind of cute. It's amazing what some men will do to get a woman. One man was sitting on an airplane. Beautiful brunette sits down next to him. He thought he would try to make a move, so he started asking her, tell me what kind of men you're interested in. So she said, well, I really like Indians because of their high cheekbones and their chiseled features. She said, but I also like Jewish men because they're kind of brilliant and they seem to be financially successful. She goes, but I don't know. I really like those good old boys from the South. There's just something about a Southern boy. So she said, by the way, what is your name? He says, well, my name is Geronimo Bernstein, but my friends call me Bubba. I guess that's one way to meet a future spouse. So today we're going to find out how Abraham says to do it, all right? So last week, Abraham's wife Sarah dies. We saw that. Abraham and Isaac are now left without her. And Abraham knows that in order for God's promise to actually come to fruition, that his descendants, will be this nation we know as the Jewish nation, Isaac is going to need to get with the program. And Isaac is going to need to find a wife, and he's going to need to start having some children. But it's funny because he's 40 years old. And he's apparently pretty happy being single because you don't see him out running around looking for a wife. But I think Abraham's like, son, it's time for me to kick you out of the nest, okay? So today Isaac is going to be given a bride. And it actually will be like an arranged marriage. But here's the cool part. It will be arranged by God himself. Now, arranged marriages seem really, really odd to us, especially in the United States where we have TV shows like, The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, or we watch Hallmark movies and we just think that whole lovey-dovey, I fall in love with you, you fall in love with me, and you're my soulmate. We hear those kind of things. But what that does is it makes us think that marriage is really based on emotions and feeling and how I feel about you and what you do for me. And yet, the sad part is that many marriages that start out that way end up in divorce. So, Pastor Skip Heitzig, he was talking with some people in India, and he was meeting with some ministry leaders there. And so he was told there that a lot of people in the country, a lot of Christian, in that country, they still have marriages that are arranged by the parents. And Skip was shocked, and he was like, I can't believe you guys still do that. And the ministry leader in India said this. He said, however you argue the point, I will tell you that our divorce rate is very, very small. He said to Skip, how about yours in the United States? And Skip couldn't argue with that. But here is what the ministry leader said in India. He said, we have a culture where relationships are based upon decision, will, and commitment before emotions and romance enter the picture. So stability of that relationship is far better than otherwise. They're raised and go into an understanding, I am going to make a commitment. I'm going to exercise my will regardless of who that person is. And in the Christian home, trusting that the Lord is behind all of it. Pastor Robert Quaney makes a great point adding this to it. He says, "Can anyone doubt the troubled state of marriage? Across the nation, we average 1 divorce decree for every 2 marriage licenses. In some parts of the country, as many divorces as marry each year. It seems this problem can, at least in part, be traced to the high demands we make on marriage. Particularly, we have tremendously high emotional expectations. Our ancestors appreciated an emotionally satisfying relationship, but not as the first priority. They had more fundamental expectations. At the dawn of history, people married primarily for safety, not romance. In a hunting and gathering culture, the family was society's unit for physical survival. As our ancestors settled into communities, the family became society's unit for economic survival. While people still needed one another for protection and to ensure propagation of the species, practical economic consideration was more important than emotional fulfillment. A husband and wife needed one another and needed children to make a living." Here's what he said: "If they happened to develop a caring relationship along the way, all the better. But that was not the central purpose of marriage." Now, obviously, something has changed. We do not marry for economic or survival reasons. Men do not need wives to help with the farm. Women do not need husbands to support them. Today, people marry expecting more. We want our husband or wife to make us feel loved and feel appreciated. Today, emotional support is the central reason for the relationship. If great-grandma and great-grandpa loved one another in the sense that we have come to use the word, it was considered a wonderful added benefit, but not a requirement. We've kind of come down a different road when it comes to finding someone who we should marry. But I thought it was a great reminder that things were really, really different back then, and especially back in biblical days too. So, as we pick up our story today, we're going to see that the most important part of finding a spouse is learning to do this. It's trusting the Lord. Because that's clearly what's behind Abraham getting a wife for his son Isaac. But sadly, most love stories don't really include that trusting the Lord part of it. But this story is a little bit different, quite a bit different actually, because Isaac doesn't even go find a wife for himself. Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for his son Isaac. The servant brings the girl back. Isaac and the girl get married, and then they live happily ever. It's really weird. That doesn't make sense to us in today's day and age. So let's pick up our story in Genesis 24, verse 1. Abraham was now old and well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed him in every way. This made me laugh. Someone said there's 4 stages of man. Stage 1 is when man believes in Santa Claus. Stage 2 is when man doesn't believe in Santa Claus. Stage 3 is when man is Santa Claus. And stage 4 is when man looks like Santa Claus. And I laugh because Abraham is pretty much in that 4th stage, okay? He's probably older, gray, white beard, it's kind of like what our Santa Claus looks like. But now Abraham is about 140 years old. And I wonder if Abraham, think about half of his life was just waiting for Isaac, waiting. And I wonder if he's like, oh, here we go again. And now he's waiting for Isaac to get married, and then he's waiting for Isaac to have some, children so Abraham can have some grandchildren. But the problem with finding a wife for Isaac is that they lived in the land of Canaan. And the women in Canaan worshiped false gods. And I bet there were very, very few followers of the one true God. So I first want to talk to those of you who are thinking maybe about getting married. Maybe you're a widower. Maybe you're thinking of getting remarried. Maybe you're young and you're thinking, oh, I should get married. I want to talk to you. And then the second part here, I want to encourage those of you who are married, but actually you're not married to a Christian. And there's no going back, but it's really hard. So I want to kind of touch on both of those things as we're seeing Abraham making sure that his son has a wife. So here's where I want to start. Before Cheyenne and Brad got married, honestly, both of them, knowing both of them, like I knew Cheyenne, but Brad now, it was very frustrating for both of them. because she really wanted to marry someone who loved Jesus. And not just like, oh, I'm a Christian, but really loved Jesus and served Jesus. But there were not many guys out there like that. And for Brad, the story on the other side, he wanted a wife that was like that. And there just are not that many women out there for the men. Now, it's interesting because when I grew up, I was always told there's lots of fish in the ocean. Like if someone would break up with me, or, don't worry, Lisa, there's lots of fish in the ocean. In other words, the ocean is filled with lots of single men. The guy that just broke up with you, he's just one of many. But here's the problem, is that when you add, now I want a Christian, to that ocean theory, the ocean pretty much just goes to a lake, because there's not that many. But when you add to this Christian word someone who's totally sold out for Jesus, that lake just turned into a shallow pond. Because there aren't many of those out there. For those women that are looking for really strong men spiritually, they're really hard to find. And for the men who are looking for women who really love Jesus, they're actually hard to find too. Because there's a lot of people who say, well, I'm a Christian, I prayed that prayer, I asked Jesus in my heart. But there's a huge difference between someone who says that and someone who really is following Jesus and serving him. Now, I assume this is the problem with finding a wife for Isaac in Canaan. Because for him, I don't even think it was a pond, all right? I think for him, it was probably like a fishbowl. Not many women at all to choose from. Verse 2 says this, he, meaning Abraham, said to the chief servant in his household, the one in charge of all that he had, he said, put your hand under my thigh. Now that seems a little weird, but they didn't have a Bible to swear on, like swear to me on the Bible. They didn't have that. And the thigh was considered the strongest muscle, and so that's how they did it. They swore on their thigh muscle, okay? Verse 3 says, I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I am living. See, that is really, really important for us even today. Abraham is making a point. I do not want my son to marry someone who is not a follower of God. And please, he's saying, don't let my son marry any of the Canaanite women. That would be like us saying, don't marry a non-Christian. Don't marry someone who's not sold out for Jesus. Don't do that. Because for Abraham, a lot was at stake. Abraham knew something about his son, that God had big, big plans for his descendants. Like his descendants would be the entire nation of Israel, the Jews as we know them. And so Abraham's going to have to do everything that he can as a father to point his son Isaac in the right direction. Because who he would marry would have a huge impact on these future generations. And the same is for us too. So putting God in this equation should always be first and foremost in any decisions that we make, especially when we're going to find someone to marry. Now, as Christians, that should be the norm. That should just be the normal way of thinking. And some of you get that. Some of you understood that before you said, I do. You looked for someone who wanted to follow Jesus and serve him. You surrendered your life to Jesus before you ever made that decision. And you knew you needed to find somebody who felt the same way so you could both serve God together. But here's the deal. We live in a world now where most Christians do not even understand that kind of thinking. They don't think along those lines. And we're actually not even being taught the importance of this in church. For me, I knew I was supposed to marry a Christian. But back then, that just meant someone that would just pray a prayer and ask Jesus in his heart. And if they just said that quick prayer, then that I knew they were in and I was good to go. It never dawned on me that there was a serious difference between somebody who really followed Jesus full-heartedly, surrendered their life, and someone who just prayed a quick prayer. I read about these two people in college. Some of you will know the name. Elizabeth and Jim Elliot. When I was up at NEU, I was reading Elizabeth Elliot's book, Through Gates of Splendor. And as I was reading it, I thought, oh, for the love. this just sounds foreign, the way they dated, the way they courted, like how their relationship even began. And it rocked my world, because actually what she was saying wasn't what I was hearing in any church world whatsoever. Because for me, like I said, I would say I was a Christian. But Elizabeth and Jim were doing it so different. They almost seemed a little over the top, a little too Jesus freakish, a little too serious about their faith. And when I was in college, I didn't get that. Now, I totally get that. It makes total sense to me now. And I think Abraham, being older, knew that his son would have to marry someone totally sold out for God, because he knew God had given Isaac this big picture of what his life was going to look like. I want to read the story of Jim and Elizabeth. We'll read it together here. Jim and Elizabeth met and fell in love while they were students at Wheaton College in the late 40s. There was only one problem. God had called Jim to work as a jungle missionary. Older missionaries had told him that single men were needed to do jobs married ones could never do, because there were some areas where women could not go. So Jim took their word for it and committed himself to bachelorhood for as long as the will of God required. Right there, that's just so amazing to me. You don't find that. Now it's like, I need to get married, I have needs, I have to do this, instead of going, God, what do you want me to do? Like, am I supposed to be serving you before I get married? It was such a great reminder of that's kind of how it should be. So what that meant is that this meant saying goodbye to Elizabeth at graduation in 1948, not knowing if they would ever see each other again. It was not the right time for him to get married, because he felt God was calling him to other more important things. 4 years later, in 1952, Jim sailed to Ecuador to work with the Quechua Indians in the east. Elizabeth later that year ended up in the same country working with the Colorado Indians in the west. A year later, in 1953, they met in Quito, where they were engaged because marriage was no longer a detour from God's plan for either one of their lives. Then it was the right time for them to be married. This, of course, is the story of Jim and Elizabeth Elliot, who together became missionaries to the Wadani Indians of Ecuador. But here's what's kind of heartbreaking. After 2 years, after Jim and Elizabeth were married, they had a baby, they had a little girl. Jim was murdered by those same Indians he was trying to save. Now, some people look at that and they say, that's ridiculous. What a waste of life. What a waste of marriage. But in God's economy, it wasn't a waste of life at all, because they did what God asked them to do and called them to do. Think of this. People die early, even when they're called to do things by God. Jesus died at 33, doing exactly the will of God. Paul was beheaded at about 60 years old, doing exactly the will of God. James, the first apostle that was martyred, he was in his 40s, doing exactly the will of God. Because here's the deal, when you can find someone to marry and they understand what you understand, is what Paul says, is that to live is Christ, to die is gain. And for Elizabeth and Jim, they walked into marriage knowing that, and knowing that going to the mission field. But the good part about that story is that imagine the amount of men and women that will be in heaven because of Jim and Elizabeth's decision. There are many believers today that became Christians after this whole murder of Jim. And God used Jim's death and this story to spark a worldwide missionary movement that actually is still reaching people today. So what I did is I found this short little video. Jim and Elizabeth's daughter wrote this after her mom passed away. She found some letters from her dad that her dad and mom were writing back and forth. The problem with this video is I can't show it on our video, so I will put a link below that. So if you're interested, it's about 1.5 minutes long, but it's really sweet. It's really sweet. And how she said they were always talking to one another about what they were reading in their Bible and what books they were reading and how they were growing in their faith. And it was just so adorable. So hopefully you can watch that. But here's the deal we're not being taught this kind of faith in America. And it scares me, Because what's happening is we've become so much on me, me, me. I want to get married for me. I want my needs met. I need you to take care of me. I need you to emotionally take care of me. And it's so much worldly stuff and not so much eternal stuff. And that's why getting married and who you marry is so important. And you need to be on the same page about serving the Lord. So if you're thinking of getting married, if you're thinking about getting remarried, if you've been widowed, make sure that serving God is your number one first prerequisite. Because here's what 2 Corinthians 6:14 says, do not be bound together with unbelievers. Verse 14 in a different translation says, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. This unequally yoked is kind of like a farming analogy, because if you were a really smart farmer, you're going to find two animals to be yoked together to work the fields. You want them to be the same size, the same temperament. You're not going to put like your German Shepherd dog with an ox, or you're not going to put a sheep with an ox. You need to get two animals together, same size, same temperament, because they need to plow in the same direction, same speed, same goal. And that's why I think Paul uses this as an illustration. Don't be unequally yoked, because there's going to be a tug of war going on in your household when you want to go to church and you want to serve God and he doesn't, and there's not this working together. It's hard enough to live as Christians, even in a Christian marriage. It's hard enough to live that way without being married to someone who doesn't share that with you at all. So if you're thinking about getting married, here's my thought. Make sure your future spouse is committed or more committed to Christ than you are. I cannot stress this enough. Don't be dating unbelievers. Don't be getting into a serious relationship with those who are lukewarm Christians, because otherwise, here you go, you're going to have a tough time living for the Lord. There's so much of this online dating out there right now, and it's so interesting because all someone has to do is say, are you a Christian? And the other person goes, absolutely. Oh, yay. And we're fine. Don't do that. Because someone can say they're a Christian, in their mind that just means I live in America, okay? So really take this serious, because Abraham knew this. He was not about to let his son get involved with a Canaanite woman and marry someone who did not love God or was not on the same page. This was important to Abraham 4,000 years ago, and it actually should be really important for us today. So now I want to move past those who want to get married, and I want to encourage those of you who are married to someone who's not a Christian. Now, I hear from women a lot, and what happens is a lot of women got saved, became followers of Jesus after they were married. So now they're already in a married relationship. They weren't even Christians when they got married. And it's really hard for them. Some women got married because their husbands, their future husbands, were so close to giving their life to Jesus. So they married him anyway, thinking that they could save him. But now they've been married 10, 20, 50 years, and their husband never got saved. And it's really difficult, and I feel your pain. Rob said he was a believer when we got married. I don't think he really was. And it was very, very difficult on our marriage to begin with. Because it's hard when you have two belief systems in your household. And thank the Lord, God saved him many, many years later, and he's a different man today. But at the time, it's really hard. So I want you to know I feel your pain. But that's what Abraham is trying to avoid for Isaac. And many of you, sometimes when you're married to a non-believer, it's exhausting. It's exhausting to feel like you're persecuted, and they laugh at your faith. And some people just want to give up. That's what happened to Olivia Langdon. She was a believer. She grew up in a Christian home. She fell in love with Mark Twain, at best an agnostic. She thought she could win him to faith in Christ, and so what happened is he pretended to become a believer so he could marry her. But right after they were married, according to one scholar, his religious feelings at the time, expressed in love letters, disappeared. After the wedding, Twain started ridiculing Olivia's beliefs and devotion. Soon her optimism began to fade. Her fervent faith cooled. Eventually, she gave up her faith altogether. and deep depression set in. Mark Twain loved her, and he said he never meant to hurt her, but he had broken her spirit. He told her, "Livy, if it comforts you to lean on your faith, do so." But she replied sadly, "I cannot. I do not have any faith left." If you are married to someone who isn't a believer, I want to encourage you with this. Jesus made it clear in this world, whether you're married to a non-believer or you work with people that aren't Christians or your family aren't Christians, whatever, Jesus made it clear that in this world you're going to have trouble. And if you're a follower of Jesus, no matter if you're in a marriage like that with a non-Christian spouse, life is going to get more difficult. Stephen McAlpine, in his book Being the Bad Guys, says this: signing up for Team Jesus in AD 50 resulted in the same cultural rejection as it does now. Jesus told his disciples, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first." John 15:18, nothing in the Gospels gives us any indication that there will be a blanket acceptance of Jesus and his message. It's just the opposite. See, we don't like that. We don't want to feel uncomfortable. We want to be happy. We want to feel loved, especially in our marriage. But sometimes there's so much backlash when you're married to a non-believer. But here's what I'm hoping for you. I want to encourage you to say, please hang in there. Because no matter if, like I said, if you work with people that aren't Christians, if the rest of your family aren't Christians, it doesn't really matter. Because the Apostle Paul says this: Paul wasn't concerned about his happiness or his feelings. You can be a Christian and not be worried about those things. He was concerned about living for Jesus no matter if he was in a good situation or a bad. See, what I'm trying to tell you is you can be sold out for Jesus and be married to someone who maybe isn't. Maybe you even feel like you don't even love. You want to find a Christian man. Maybe you feel nothing for that person. Maybe he laughs at your faith and makes fun of you. But here is the encouraging news. Paul lived his life confronted by people like that daily. And if that sounds like your marriage, Paul got people to be around him to help him grow in his faith no matter what, to help him through those times. So for you, you may need to make sure you stay attached to a church. If your husband doesn't want you to go to church, well, you need to tell him that that's really important to you. You need to continue reading your Bible. You need to have good Christian friends that will help you stay grounded in the Word. You need to pray for your spouse, love them, be the best follower of Jesus you can. Because Peter says in 1 Peter 3:1 that says, by your behavior, you can win your husband without even a word. It's kind of awesome. All right, back to Abraham. He has a servant promise him that he will do this. Look at verse 3. I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I am living, but will go to my country and my own relatives and get a wife for my son Isaac. Why? Because Abraham knows that the women in Canaan, they don't have the same belief system, but his relatives would. So the servant asks a very valid question. The servant says, well, what if the woman is unwilling to come back with me to this land? Shall I then take your son back to the country you came from? Make sure you do not take my son back there, Abraham said. The servant's like, what do I do if I can't find a girl? And should I just haul Isaac back? Absolutely not. And the reason why is because God knew that this land that they were standing on was this promised land. We know of Israel as Israel today, but this land was part of this covenantal promise that God had given to Abraham. And he knew Isaac needed to be in the land to raise his family in the land. But here's what's so awesome about Abraham. For everything that he had been through, he learned over the last 50 years what it meant to really trust God. And I mean, really trust God. And this is the place that I'm hoping you and I can get to. Look what he says in verse 7. The Lord, the God of heaven, who brought me out of my father's household and my native land, and who spoke to me and promised me on oath, saying, to your offspring I will give this land. Here's what he says. This is so cool. He says, he will send his angel before you so that you can get a wife for my son from there. Abraham's like, I know God. He gave me promises. He never lets me down. He can do anything. He's going to send an angel and prepare somebody's heart, a woman's heart, to want to come back 400 miles to marry Isaac. But I love it because right after he's so confident of that, he says this in verse 8, "And if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be released from this oath. Only do not take my son back there." In other words, if the woman won't come back with you, it's okay. It's okay. And I want desperately for you and me, for all of us, to get to that point, to know that yes, God can do exactly what we're asking. There's certain things in my life right now that I'm asking, begging God for, and I believe he can do it. I don't know if he will. Because here's what I do know. If he doesn't, we believe God is doing something different than we thought he would. See, I thought God is doing one thing, but he may be doing something completely different. And I realized that's exactly where Abraham was. He was believing God, that God wanted him to go and do something, like find a wife for his son, believing that God, would provide a wife, but believing also that if he didn't, that would be okay too. It's that whole moment of surrender. God, I'm trusting you, but you do what you need to do. It's a really, really great place to be and a really great way to live. This just happened to us, and I honestly, if you knew my life right now, you would totally understand this. But I'm pretty sure I told you about this. The problem is I can't remember when, okay? I'm running a lot of lessons at a time, and I know I told you that we bought a new house, but I really can't remember if I did that in the Psalm series or if I did that in this series. So we have new people joining us all the time, so I'm going to tell it again, and hopefully it will make sense right here. I did a lesson a while back about how God shows up and he moves us in different directions, but just in the course of our everyday life. A lot of times he doesn't work in like emotional church services. A lot of times, even when we're praying, it's not even when he shows up. Sometimes he just shows up randomly in a normal daily event. And we're going to see this as Abraham's servant shows up to Rebekah's town, and she's just out watering her sheep. Okay, she's just doing something normal. And then God steps in and changes her entire life. So here was our random event. About 3 years ago, we moved into a home, and we'd lived in a home for about 25 years. We raised all of our kids there. We wanted to downsize because it was Rob and I and Dusty. We knew Dusty would be eventually going off to school. So we found this house that was perfect for Rob and myself, but we downsized so much that nobody ever wants to come see us because the family room's really small and there's nothing for the kids to do, and it's in the middle of the desert, and so it was just kind of weird. So for us, it was a great home to retire in, and we just said, well, this will be our body bag house. That's what we call it. So we have some land where it sits on. So Rob is subdividing the property because he's going to build some spec homes right next to it. But as he's working on this project, one morning at about 5 a.m., we were talking, and it's like, hey, we should go on Zillow. Let's look at some comps in the area so that we know what we should sell these new houses that we're going to build for. So we're looking for comps, but the first thing I see is this house. Random, pops up. It's in New River where we live. And now remember, we're not looking for a house. We love our house. We have no problem with our house. And never in a million years have we ever even thought to move. But something struck me about this house, and I told Rob, where is this? I've never even seen this house, and we live in this area. So we were kind of joking, and I'm like, I think I need this house. So it was 5:30 in the morning, and I go, well, let's go just look at the outside of it, because A, it had such a pretty view, and I couldn't even believe it. So I'm like, let's just hop in the car and go see it. Well, it's actually 3 miles from our house, and it's in an area that we never even knew existed. And suddenly, I'm like, I don't know, I kind of think we need to move to that house. It has a small little pool. The grandkids now can come over and swim. The house that we live in right now has really it's 2 bedrooms and an office, and we were going to change one of the bedrooms into a closet, so it was really going to be a 2-bedroom house. No place for our grandkids. So now the house this house we're looking at it has a couple extra bedrooms. So if Cheyenne and Brad, who live over an hour away, want to come spend the night, or if, they can do that. Now we have the ability to see our grandchildren, and they have something to do. So all that to say, along with this was a guest house. And we realized we could take our entire ministry and move it to the guest house where we have the studio. I now have an office, and now we have a place where we can store all of our books and journals, and we can do all of our shipping station out of there. So, and it's all located in one place. And so I always say that this is a house that I never knew we even needed. Because like I said, moving was never on our radar. And it was just in the course of an everyday event, like, hey, go on Zillow, look for comps in the area so we can see what to sell, the spec houses that Rob is going to build. So that afternoon we called Rob's brother and we're like, we want to go see this house, just random. And then we saw it, and then we put in an offer. And then the realtor said, well, someone else is looking at the house in an hour after we looked at it. And then he said, I've got it scheduled for someone to look at it the following day. And so we're just like, okay, God, is this you? Did you put this house in front of us because you wanted us to move? Is this you moving us to a new place, or is it us? Like, I don't really know. And then I go like, why? Why now? So we prayed and we just said, God, if this house isn't for us, then the person that's going to look at it in an hour, make them buy it. Okay? If it's not for us, the person looking at it tomorrow, have them buy it. And so God, would you just give us some direction here? And you know what I heard from God? Silence. Like literally silence. But the weird thing is that I had total peace. It was odd because for us, it was it wasn't like, I have to have this house, I want this house. It wasn't like that. It was like, God, here's the deal. If you want us to have the house, you're going to have to wide open the doors. And I kept thinking of that verse with Moses when he's leading the Israelites, and he kept saying to God, I don't want to go anywhere if your presence is not with me. And we were like that. We were like, God, we just want to be where you want us to be. That was really our heart's cry. And so I realized this was a matter of trusting God. He could turn the owner's heart, because we offered a lot less than what he was asking to sell it to us, or he could turn the owner's heart to sell it to someone else. And we just didn't know where it was going to go. But sometimes I think we overthink things like this. And I think that because we have thoughts and we have desires, I think we don't know. So we just move forward with it. And God kept opening doors and opening doors. But I realized that what matters to God is that we love him most and serve him. And I don't think it matters whether I live on 11th Avenue or 16th Street. Like, I don't think that really matters to him. Now, the point to all of that story is I think that's what's going on with Abraham. He thinks, like we think that we're supposed to get this house, that God wants him to send a servant to go find a wife. But does he know for sure? Like, was that God pushing him? Was that God pushing up for the house? I think so. Like, he went for it. We went for it. And I think sometimes it's a matter of just stepping out in faith. Sometimes you need to just go apply to that college or go apply for that job you want. Maybe for those of you, it's like, you met that really super awesome Christian guy and he asked you out and you're like, I don't know, should I go? Should I not? Well, maybe you need to step out and do that. Maybe you need to go meet your new neighbors. Maybe you need to go tell someone about Jesus. For us, it's like maybe you need to go buy a new house that you weren't even looking for. Just let God pave the way for you. And then if a stoplight shows up, then stop. Don't push through or run the red stoplight. Just wait on God. Go along for the ride and see what God is doing. Verse 9. So the servant put his hand under the thigh of his master Abraham and swore an oath to him concerning this matter. Then the servant took 10 of his master's camels and left, taking with him all kinds of good things from his master. He set out for Aram Naharaim and made his way to the town of Nahor. Now this would have taken a couple months, probably 400 miles one way, with a caravan of camels, okay? Now I'm gonna put a map up here so you can see this. They lived all the way down, I think he was down in, it's hard to say, I can't even see it because my contacts aren't, but he lived way, way far south, Berla, Hoy, Roy, whatever that was. I think that's where he was living at this particular time. He could have been living a little bit farther up in Hebron. That's a possibility too. So, you know, I'm not exactly sure because I can't remember because that's my brain right now. But the bottom line is that there, a few years back, somebody said there were no domesticated camels back in the days of Abraham. The Bible's false, okay? And that kind of went on for some time. And so someone finally put a video out on why camels really were in the time of Abraham. So I'm going to put the link below for you because, like I said, I can't show these videos on our video because of all the copyright. But if you're interested in camels and what this is all about, in case anyone ever says something to you, now you'll know. So the link will be in the bottom of that. All right, so the servant gets to the town of Nahor. Look at verse 11. He had the camels kneel down near the well outside the town. It was towards evening, the time the women go out to draw water. And I love what the servant does. He prays. That's the first thing he does when he gets there is he prays. He doesn't just look around for some girl who looks like she wants to get married. He prays. But he's not even praying for like 5'9" with red hair, great body, high-powered job on Wall Street. He's not praying for that. He prays knowing what's at stake. A woman for the promised son, Isaac. Because whoever she will be, she's going to be the future mother of the nation of Israel. Like, imagine that. Because through her lineage would come Jesus, the other promised son. And somehow this servant knows how important this is. But he knows this. He does his part knowing and trusting that God would do his part. See, we do our part. And then we just trust God's going to do what he does in the background to bring it all to fruition. And that's the place that I want us to get to in our life. Knowing that God is so powerful and so big that he can do anything that seems impossible. So here is his servant praying for something that feels impossible. Because think about this. He's looking for a girl who is willing to leave her family, and travel 400 miles. They didn't have planes or trains. She knew she would be cut off from her family and would most likely never see them again. He's looking for a girl who would be attracted to Isaac and want to live this nomadic life. I was thinking this is the ultimate blind date. Like, what if she saw Isaac and did this? or what if she saw Isaac and did this? Or what if Isaac saw her and they just kind of went like this? I don't know why those made me laugh. But see, this is an impossible task. It feels like an impossible task. So verse 12 says this, then he prayed, O Lord, God of my master Abraham, give me success today and show kindness to my master Abraham. See, I'm standing beside the spring and the daughters of the townspeople are coming out to draw water. May it be that when I say to a girl, please let down your jar that I may have a drink, and she says, drink, and I'll water your camels too, let her be the one you have chosen for your servant Isaac. By this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master. I love how this servant makes it really specific. He doesn't want to take the wrong girl back to Isaac. So he puts this stipulation, have her asked to water my camels too. Because that would say a lot about this girl. Because when camels take a long journey, they can go, of course, we know, for days without water. But once they require water, 10 camels would require like 4 huge barrels worth of water. So it's not like she just goes over and gets a cup and be like, here, little camel, have a drink. It's not like that. She is going to have to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. It's a huge undertaking. And this just asking to be a servant like this, to serve this man's camels, and she doesn't know anything about this guy. This tells what she's like. It tells the character that he's looking for: industrious, hardworking, a servant, kind to strangers, unselfish. And I would say that most girls probably wouldn't do this. But this is a prerequisite for the servant. And if a girl accepts his request, this would be an answer to his prayer. So look at verse 15. Before he even finished his prayer, Rebekah comes out with her jar on her shoulder. She was the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, who was the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor. I'm putting up a family tree here so you can see Abraham, and then you see he's got a brother named Nahor, and through his kids, and it comes Rebekah. Rebekah was actually a great niece to Abraham and a second cousin to Isaac. Now some of you are like, oh, that's gross. Okay, well at the time, remember, this is Genesis. The law wasn't even in place. There was no law. Moses hasn't come on the scene yet. So there was no law forbidding it because there was no law yet. And Abraham and Sarah, think about that. They were half brother and sister. They did that back then. So why? GotQuestions.org tells us, before the law was given in the early days of humanity, there was a need for marriage between close relatives, as there were a limited number of human beings. Adam and Eve's children married their siblings by necessity. Even in those days, however, marriage between a parent and a child were not allowable, as Genesis 2:24 implies. This is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. A man was to leave his mother, not marry her. So just so you know that. It was not until humanity increased greatly on the earth that people no longer needed to intermarry among relatives. In the early days of humanity, the human genetic code was not corrupted to the extent that it is today. Therefore, marriages between close relatives carried little risk of genetic abnormalities in the children they produce. Once the human race expanded and due to sin, the human genetic code grew more corrupt, God commanded against the marriage of close relatives. But back then, it was okay. So now that we understand that. So this girl shows up at the well, verse 16. The girl was very beautiful, a virgin. No man had ever lain with her. She went down to the spring, filled her jar, and came up again. Now, the girl was beautiful. That was probably a bonus for this guy. Verse 17, the servant hurried to meet her and said, please give me a little water from your jar. And look at her heart. She says, drink, my lord, she said, and quickly lowered the jar to her hands and gave him a drink. After she had given him a drink, she said, I will draw water for your camels too, until they have finished drinking. And the servant is probably going, what? Yes, this is exactly what I prayed for, and God did this. Verse 20, so she quickly emptied her jar into the trough, ran back to the well to draw more water, and drew enough for her camels. Verse 21, without saying a word, the man watched her closely to learn whether or not the Lord had made his journey successful. Now, I like this verse because it's nice to know that we all question, is this really what God wants? Like, I think it is, but I don't really know. Like, here is the girl that did exactly what he prayed for. And yet there was still a little doubt in his mind. And that makes me feel a little bit better about my life, because a lot of times I assume God is wanting me to go this direction. I'm pretty confident he is, but I'm never 100% confident, okay? Sometimes it's just a matter of stepping out in faith, because I don't know if that's exactly what God's calling me to do. And I think a lot of that's just the more you grow up in your faith, because here's what happens. As you grow up in your faith, it's not so much, God, I want this, God, give me this. It's more, God, what do you want? God, I want what you want. I want your will for my life. God, what do you want? And that's what's going on here. This servant is saying, God, I don't want what I want, or even what Abraham wants. God, I want what you want. I need to make sure that this is what you want. Verse 22, when the camels had finished drinking, the man took out a gold nose ring weighing a beka and 2 gold bracelets weighing 10 shekels. Verse 23, he says, whose daughter are you? Please tell me, is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night? She answered him, I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son that Milcah bore to Nahor. Not only is this servant in the town of Abraham's people, but this girl is an actual relative of Abraham's brother. It's so fascinating. It's amazing. And this was the greatest news ever. Verse 25 says this, and she added, we have plenty of straw and fodder, as well as room for you to spend the night. Verse 26, then the man bowed down and worshiped the Lord, saying, praise be to the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his kindness and faithfulness to my master. As for me, the Lord has led me on this journey to the house of my master's relative. It's this beautiful, beautiful story. So what are the takeaways today? First, do this. Make sure you seek first God. When it comes time to finding someone to marry, seek God first. Or anything, finding the job, finding the house, finding whatever. Always seek God first. If it's marriage, never forget the story of Elizabeth and Jim Elliot. If you want to read their book, here's a picture of it, Through Gates of Splendor. It is an amazing reading experience. And it'll really remind you of what it means, what the cost is of following Jesus. And if you're thinking about getting married, make sure your future spouse is as committed or more committed to Christ than you are. But if you're listening to this and you are married to someone who isn't a follower of Christ, can I just say, hang in there. Don't walk away. God wants to use you right where you are. Because following Jesus, I get it, is difficult when you're in a bad marriage. But like Paul, you can go through anything in this life, bad marriage, bad job, bad family, bad whatever, with joy, knowing that you're serving Jesus well right where he has you. And then this, trust God that he's leading and guiding you. We see this with Abraham. He was so sure that God wanted him to send his servant to a distant land to find a wife for Isaac. And he trusted, he leaned on, he relied on, and was confident that God was going to make that happen. He knew God would work out all the details. And you're able to learn to do that the more that you know God. I want to end by saying what I always say. Open your Bible. Start reading. Spend time reading, not just reading to read, but studying these people and these stories. And your life will change. Because what will happen is you start getting this huge, high view of God. Just like we saw with Abraham and the servant. And both of them were like, God, I know you can. I'm trusting you will. But if you don't, I'm okay with that too. Because that's my greatest desire for all of us. Hope this helps today. Have a really good day.